What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast today. As always, joined by Mike Murray through the screen, and with us once again, Dr. Scott Stevenson. Scott, how are you today? And thanks for being on.
I am good. We have normal electrical power here, which is nice. It's the first step, I think, in order to do some of these things. Working computer, then podcast technology, then we can go. So we're ready to roll.
Prior to the recording today, just for the listeners, give a little background on that. I know Scott was struggling with his power situation. He had a storm come through. I think he said it was yesterday, the last couple of days. But yeah, it's all good now. It's all cleared up, and I think we're ready to rock. So just kind of going right into it. Last time we kind of talked about nutritional strategies for maximizing the off season and didn't get so much into the training aspect of things. So today we kind of want to dive into that with you and kind of getting right into that. So when we kind of apply the foundational principles of an effective training program, we have those in place, we can kind of go a variety of ways and take some different approaches that are going to help us utilize those principles to make significant gains along the way. And then at the end of the day, we have to individualize our program. And until we gather more data on genetic testing, like Mike kind of referred to a little bit before our recording started, we're going to have to use some trial and error here to figure out what is going to work best for us. And then an extended off season is probably going to be a good opportunity to do this. And we want to follow up on your concepts of being your own bodybuilding coach because, at the end of the day, like I said, individualization, we got to figure out how we can optimize training given the principles. So can you kind of provide us a general structure of how we can go about this experimentation process of determining frequency and volume for ourselves?
Yes, I think the first thing to do is take an honest look at why you're training, what motivates you, and then, as is always said about diet, the diet's going to work the best is the one you'll be able to stick to. Same thing holds for training. So I actually mentioned this, and I'm sure it wasn't our podcast, so we didn't get into training, but sometimes they get blurred together. A time when I was just restarting DC training with one of the trainers at my gym years ago, and he wanted to hop in with me. He's like, he wants to put on size. It's time to go. Blah blah blah. And we got to the end of the workout where you do a widowmaker on squats, and we got all the way to there. I did my widowmaker, and the widowmaker is basically the idea that the set is extended as if you're on a suicide mission in some way, shape, or form. You're just trying to get as many reps as you possibly can. It's not something you typically see people do. And I finished my set, kind of caught my breath. I looked up at him and asked him what weight he wanted on the bar. He hadn't even gotten up yet. He was just still sitting there, and he said, "I don't want to do that." and that was it. And that was he didn't do that, and that was our last workout together because he was honest with himself. He didn't want to train that way. Now, if he could have hypnotized himself, at least for the period of those training bouts, maybe DC training would have worked for him. But otherwise, no way. No bueno. So that's kind of the first thing that needs to sort of, I think, be done is someone size up their level of motivation and what they're willing to do over the course of the long haul, what they can be consistent with. So we know, if you look into, and I think this is one of the questions we may dive deep into, some of the studies demonstrating this dose response in terms of training volume. The criticism that the main thing that I sort of see when I look at the studies, for instance, the Brad Schoenfeld study, where it's been criticized because the volume was so high there, 45 sets per week in the highest training group to failure. That's failure in the context of what they did in their lab. I know that I and people that I've trained with I would be in the hospital with rhabdomyolysis if I tried to do 45 sets to failure the way I typically do my sets. It just would absolutely not work. But I have no doubt, and no way do I question whatsoever, that those individuals did that according to the criteria they set in their lab throughout the course of that study. That happened. That wasn't fabricated data. That wasn't made up, and just plopped into an Excel spreadsheet or SPSS and analyzed statistically. It actually happened. So there are people that could train to whatever they consider to be failure with a higher volume and perhaps make better gains in that sense. That may change over time, but basically that sort of points to the idea of people can make phenomenal gains on DC training if you're really willing to bury yourself. And that's a question I get a lot. That's at sort of one end of the spectrum, where you've got one or two or maybe a rest pause set where you literally are just emptying yourself into that set. And you've only got a few of those each day, and you only have like that one opportunity to provide the stimulus until you come around another 5 or 6 days later and do it again. If you're doing like a two-way split, for instance, so you might train legs on Monday and Friday, so about 5 days in between. So some people can do that, and it can definitely be effective without a doubt. And others simply don't want to do that. So you can make up for that stimulus by doing more sets that are not as close to failure. Maybe they don't have the same number of effective reps, and grow from that in that way as well. And we know, for instance, there aren't a whole lot of professional bodybuilders who train with the type of approach that Dante has professed, that Jordan Peters is the preeminent example of someone who just like lets loose on a level that very few people can or probably ever will be able to do. He unleashes an inner fury and rage, I think you'd probably agree, on many of these sets that just is something that some people don't even want to connect with, probably because it would scare the shit out of them. Like, am I actually, or maybe they don't even have that within them. He's got something very, very special. So he can do that, and that has worked for him. But you look at most pros, and many pros, and Jordan will admit this, they have better genetic attributes in terms of muscle roundness and skeletal structure, et cetera, et cetera. But there are even guys that are bigger than Jordan, of course. Not many, but there are those who got away with high volume training. Ronnie Coleman is an extreme example. Ronnie trained really, really hard, but except for maybe some of the sort of show-off sets that you'd see, on his videos, he wasn't taking all of his sets to failure. What was so amazing about Ronnie is that he was able to handle that true volume of training with leaving just enough reps in the tank to be able to handle that and do a three-way split, training 6 days a week with the loads that he did. And of course he's paid the piper for that. So that was for him a way to sort of auto-regulate what he was capable of doing. Many people are not going to be able to do that. There's just no way, shape, or form. So, but he enjoyed that. Obviously, Ronnie loved that. He wanted to be in the gym as much as he can, in a certain sense, although some people might say that doesn't look very fun, like that the trainer from my gyms, that I don't want to do that. Like, some people would have seen me do that Widowmaker and would have said, I want to be able to do that shit. I'm going to give it a go. Let's see what we can do. This is what I want in someone who's going to, and I use this term somewhat facetiously, but there's a lot of truth to this. The best training partner for me and for people of that mindset is someone who's going to, quote unquote, make them their bitch in the gym. And someone who supersedes you in terms of effort levels and strength and just what they can do. They're going to make you better because you're going to try to rise to that occasion. For some people, that's not at all what they want. So you got to figure that out first and foremost, what you're willing to do. And then I think that really is almost the first step in as to then which way are you going to go with auto-regulation, with individualization, and finding a program that works for you. And of course, there's not going to be just one in many, many cases. I suggest people rotate amongst mountain dog training, which I know a bit about, having helped John co-write his book on the training system. And DC training, I've got a lot of experience there, was the official kind of DC trainer for years. Dante would send me clients. And then, of course, my system. And you can rotate amongst those three. Those all have progressive overload built into them. There are nuances to those programs that could provide a nice way, and I think does. I know this because people have given me this feedback many, many times. It provides a nice sort of built-in way of periodizing your training. And not from program hopping, but from creating a little bit of novelty of stimulus just in the way those programs are designed. And of course, John has tons of those that are constructed in different ways with different intensification techniques. He's got some that are more high. I think he's calling them Mountain Dog 2.0, that are a little bit higher in frequency. He's got some where he's incorporated blood flow restriction. So he's got a number of different programs. So there's a whole mountain dog universe of programs that you can choose from that I know people have spent like a decade doing almost exclusively John's programs because they have the same core principles built in, but there's just some variety there. So first and foremost, kind of figure out what your mindset is. What do you want to do? And then you can kind of navigate that landscape, I think. So like one of the key features, and there's a really interesting study that was, I think Damas was the first name, and I've mentioned this before on some podcasts, that was published a couple years ago looking at frequency and actually what was volume of training. And they used an internal control. So all the subjects underwent two different conditions, training one leg one way and the other leg the other way. I think it was 3 sets per workout, and they either did 5 workouts a week, knee extensions only, or they did 2 or 3 times a week, knee extensions only, 1 for each leg. And some people, when you looked at the first publication, it suggested they compared averages, and the session there's no advantage to the higher frequency, which was also higher volume, because each training unit was 3 sets, so it was 15 sets versus 6 or 9 sets per week. No difference. Everything is sort of came out in the wash when you looked at the averages, but then they went back and they rehashed their data. And they looked at it again, and they started looking at individual responses. And there's a really nice plot. This is on one of the Muscle Minds podcasts that came out probably about 2 months ago, maybe, or 6 weeks ago. And there were some individuals who just grew. They had good genetics for muscle growth. They grew from both regimes. Then there were some that did better with the higher frequency, higher volume approach than they did with, and they just lumped the 2 or 3 weeks together because those things were so average. They ended up being basically sort of the same mathematically, statistically speaking. So they compared the 2 or 3 times a week versus the 5 times a week. Some people grew from both approaches. Some people didn't grow very well at all from either. There were literally people who were, at least in terms of that exercise stimulus, a non-responder to resistance training for putting on muscle size. And then there were some who did better with the lower frequency. So that's one aspect of one of the biggest aspects is frequency, and then overall training volume. And of course, those are highly interrelated because what you do each workout contributes to your overall volume. So how do you know what to do? Well, each set basically is sort of a unit of stimulus. And if you're someone who likes to train like Jordan or something like that, then what you do from each set is going to mean that you can't get away with very many of those. So that automatically is going to reduce the volume that you can recover from. So the next step, of course, is going to be looking at then how frequently can we train and still recover as well. So if you wanted to do like 5 sets a week, or let's say 6 sets a week, would you do 1 set 6 times a week? You could. I know someone who did that for years. He says he didn't know better. He actually has a PhD in exercise physiology when he was a kid, and he got really strong. He was a collegiate natural. I think he placed 3rd in the collegiate nationals in powerlifting way back in the day. And he maybe had good genetics. He's an N of 1, but he trained that way. And there's nothing, that if you think about it, if you think about what normally we would, and this, I always incorporate this into the idea of like what frequency makes the most sense. What normally the human body would be exposed to in terms of a stimulus that would then evoke a persistent adaptation, or at least would be registered teleologically speaking as something the body says, you know what, I think I should probably pay attention to this. It's coming at me every single day. Think of like a sunburn or a callus. Sometimes I talk about muscle growth as being sort of a muscular callus. Is it better to go and get sunburnt once a week and expect you're going to get a nice tan from that by tanning for 60 minutes? Or would it be better to get 10 minutes a day, 6 times a week? If you want to get calluses in your hands, do you do all your yard work on the weekend, or do you do some yard work each day so those calluses develop gradually? So that's one of the arguments for frequency. So back to the situation where someone is a very, very intense trainer. You got to look at then the workout that they can put together. A DC training workout, if you really put everything in, I'm just using that as sort of one end of the spectrum. If you put everything into those sets, you're not going to do very much, and you're going to be wasted. In that particular instance, neurologically speaking, you're just running out of steam because you've just emptied yourself so much. A widowmaker has an extreme impact on neurological quote unquote fatigue or inroads because you're just doing so many of those grinder reps where you're just barely able to get another rep. You got those 5-second reps at the end of each of those rest pause sets or those straight sets. Those are the ones you can't do many of those, so you're done. So the question is then, if that's your maximal output per workout, how often can you come back and do that? Can you do that 2 days later, or need to wait 5 days? About 5 or 6 days is what Dante came up with for the way he set up his basic 2-way split, and that seems to work out best for many people. But not everyone. Some people can just do it every other day, so they might train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, instead of doing just Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because they can get away with that, and the 7-day week isn't something that they have to adhere to because they've made bodybuilding a priority, or they've got gym access or what have you. Other individuals might find they need more than that. Maybe they need to take a day off every other week or every week and set it back a bit. So that's one way to look at these things is basically take the workout. How much can you do in that workout for a given split, and go from there. And then once you've basically taken one of those approaches, you've gone down the avenue of being an intensity type trainer, effort type trainer, and you figured out start with a 2-way split. Some of this is just going to be random. Pick a 2-way or a 3-way split where it makes the most sense. How often can you train with a given amount of volume? And how much volume basically do you start seeing what we would now call junk volume in a workout? And the junk volume from the perspective of that person is going to be those sets that just are not what they could be if you were otherwise fresh. Some people, there are powerlifters who will spend 4 hours in the gym. I heard Ben Chow, who's Luke Sando's best friend, when they were trained together, they spent 4 hours in the gym. They do a set, they flip the switch, do a set, and then they talk for 5-10 minutes. And they flip the switch and do a set, and they could do that, and it didn't bother them. But they had to have all that rest time, I guess, to get all those sets in that they were doing. So if that's your approach, then you set up a 2-way split. Then you may need to go to a 3-way split because you're finding now you're someone, I think this is a topic we're going to get into. You're someone who can put so much into those sets. You've gotten so good at that now you need more recovery. You become more advanced. So you think, well, one way to do that is keep my weekly frequency of the same, but split it into 3 instead of 2 workouts. So instead of an upper and lower, you do a legs push pull, for instance, and go from there. And you can just continue down that line, fine tuning various things that you're doing with your training. So that's one avenue in. If you're at the other end of the spectrum, you might be someone who's going to use more volume. And that is not my forte because I tend to focus more on what I think is the quintessential nature of the resistance exercise stimulus that makes it such a good way to produce muscle growth, is that it is extraordinary in terms of the tension that's required as well as the metabolic stress that comes with it. And the metabolic stress is another topic unto itself, but basically the energy turnover, the energy demand is so incredible. So that is what makes it such a good, if that is what makes it such a good stimulus, then focus on that. Don't do half-ass sets, so to speak. At least if you're trying to evoke the absolute most amount of stimulus and most amount of muscle growth that you can, then focus on making those sets as high quality as possible. So if you're someone who goes in so back to the high volume notion, if you're someone who goes in with that, you may find that you enjoy doing a type of training that Jay Cutler did. And he would really never go to true failure. And his rest intervals are very short. And Jay had a tremendous genetic capacity, I believe, to just handle a lot of work. So that's maybe part of why he was able to do what he did. But you may find that you can do 10 sets in that way, and you prefer to do, or even 12 sets, 3 exercises, 4 sets each, or 4 exercises, 3 sets each, and you leave 2 or 3 reps in the tank. And that keeps you fresh, and the quality of your workouts are as good from start to finish. And maybe you break that up, and you find that your recovery takes 5 days again. You could train that way with a 2-way split, and then just branch off from there. And over time, though, the thing that there's a couple things that are involved. If you're off as a newbie trainer, anything's going to work. So you can almost just go in there and pick a program, 3 sets of 10, three times a week, full body, and go from there. But eventually you're gonna find that you are able to handle more and more weight and create more and more inroads into your recovery, and you're going to have to make some adjustment one way, shape, or form. If you want to keep the volume the same, you're going to have to probably leave a few more reps in the tank, because now you're lifting heavier loads, and your nervous system is still going to be the limiting factor there. Or you may find that you're going to have to spread out the duration of recovery that you have in between. So those are 2 paths you can go. So it's too bad I don't have a dry erase here, because literally, like, this is a branching protocol to some degree. What I'm talking about here, now we're getting into complexities, but you kind of have to follow your path, and which way you go depends on what you want to do, what you think might be best, and also, more importantly, what you're willing to do. So let's make a case for a high volume type of approach, where someone does more volume on a given day, which then requires greater periods of recovery, because you can't do 15 sets every other day unless you're Ronnie Coleman. So in that case, the thing that's interesting is, and there's some mixture there's some mixed evidence to this regard, but in large part, it seems that muscle growth in the long haul is going to require an increase in the number of myonuclei within the muscle cells. You guys probably have had someone come on and talk about the myonuclear domain theory, the idea that a larger muscle cell simply needs more nuclei, because each of those nuclei governs the metabolic processes, the protein synthesis, various things that are occurring in that particular region of the cell. So if you're doubling the muscle volume and you didn't increase the number of myonuclei, those myonuclei would then be somehow stressed to take care of all the metabolic processes and the rebuilding and the reconstruction, everything that's going on in that area of the cell. And the muscle cells don't seem to like to do that. They like to sort of maintain at least somewhat of a myonuclear domain size. That's where satellite cells come into play. So if you look at, and there's not a lot of literature on this, I'm waiting to see more, but you can look at least one particular study where they did a damaging exercise. So resistance exercise or any exercise that produces damage, as well as that which is going to produce muscle growth in the long haul, and those things are not synonymous. You can run down Pikes Peak and do nothing but eccentric contractions and just make yourself sore as shit, and you will create tons of damage, but that's not the best way to grow muscle. So you turn on the satellite cells. They undergo mitosis, and you can actually look at markers. There's one of PAX7 is one particular marker that's indicative of what's going on there in terms of the satellite cell proliferation when they're undergoing mitosis, and then differentiating themselves when they donate the newly made nucleus into the cell as this process of myonuclear domain is kept in place and new nuclei are created. And that lasts up to maybe a week. It takes some time. So if you look at protein synthesis, it may be back down to a baseline in 24 hours or even less in someone who's well trained. That seems to become even a shorter duration process the more adapted to training you are. And that makes sense. You recover more quickly. You become more resistant to whatever perturbations in the in the cell homeostasis happen, the more trained you are. That's the nature of training adaptation. You think about oxygen debt, or heart rate recovery. Someone who's really aerobically trained gets their heart rate up, they stop running or stop doing the exercise, and the heart rate comes down really, really quickly. Take someone who's just undergone a standardized exercise bout, resistance exercise bout. They're trained now. Their protein synthesis goes up and comes back down much more quickly. Wasn't as stressful to them in the training state. So what training's all about is adapting to the stress, so it then becomes less stressful. But this long-term process, and this is what I haven't seen. This is what would be really interesting to see studied in more detail. This seems to take several days. It's a major overhaul in terms of the ultrastructure of the cell to bring in a new nucleus. And I don't know very much. I'm not sure how much is known as to what directs, for instance, the localization of that nucleus. Is it like when the planes land on the tarmac and you got some guy with the lights and he's like saying, "Come on down this way. We're going to put you at gate number 37." How does the satellite cell know how to migrate along the basal lamina and then undergo its process and then make its way into the cell in the right spot so that it's not cramping and doubling up with a nucleus that's already in that area? There's all sorts of stuff that, as far as I know, are unknown. I'm sure there are people who study this who have better hints than I do. But this is a big process, and it takes, probably 5 or 6, 7 days until you start to see those markers of satellite cell activity coming back to baseline. So someone who wants to do a higher volume type of approach, where they may need, or they may just take, because they're going to do so much volume in each workout. You're not going to do 20 sets of legs and 15 sets of back and 15 sets of chest and 15 sets of all in one workout 3 times a week. That just, you'd have 5-hour workouts. There'd be junk volume galore. But you can do a 5-way split, a bro split, and spread that out and then make gains in that way. And that's my guess as to why many pros do really well with the bro split, because that process is one that, once it's initiated, probably takes about a week from the data that I've been able to find. McKay is the first author, McKay, on this study I'm thinking of. It's like 2008, I think. If you look for eccentric exercise and PAC7 positive, and you'll probably find the study. I can pull it up and send it to you guys if you want to add it somewhere in the show notes. So one of the things that differentiates people who grow really well from those who don't, a couple things, is that the genetic responders, so to speak, tend to have more satellite cells in place in the first place. So it's almost as if they're already ready to expand the muscle cell volume because they've got a little bit higher satellite cell density. And they also do a better job of increasing the number of myonuclei. And the growth factors that are involved, IGF-1, myogenin, those things get elevated to a greater extent in those individuals who you'd categorize as extreme responders or the top end responders. So they have an advantage in terms of the satellite cell, in terms of the responsiveness and what happens after standardized bout to turn on this whole process, which takes a while. So if you're someone who likes to train that way and wants to split things into a bro type split, and you want to do multiple sets, only as many as you feel like you can recover from without burying yourself, or not be able to come back and train the next day, or your last 2 exercises are just for shit, then that's a great approach, and it works for many, many people. But if you've gone down that path because you like to go in the gym and get a pump, and you like to train that way, and it's fun, and you're not making gains, then you have to make the decision. And this happens to me. It happened to me actually personally. I was training that way. I was probably doing too much, but I used to train that way for well over a decade until I came to what I currently do. And that may not work for some people, in which case they have to kind of make the decision. I like to train this way. It's fun to do lots of sets. Like Arnold said, the pump is better than an orgasm. So this is great. Maybe they don't have a girlfriend or whatever. This is their thing. They want to train that way, or a boyfriend, whatever it is. And they need to make the decision whether they want to continue to train that way or maybe try something different, which might require putting more effort into each set and moving themselves down the spectrum of a higher effort lower volume, and perhaps then even a higher frequency type of approach. And that's one of the advantages that's coming out now in the research. If you look at one of Schoenfeld's meta-analyses, one of the subgroup, they looked at frequency as it may impact muscle growth. And one of the things that comes out of that, and you can see this elsewhere in the literature too, is that when you train with a higher frequency, that seems to allow for a greater per week or per unit time volume. So you maybe can get 5 high quality sets in 3 times a week, or 7 twice a week for a muscle group. Let's say 5 twice a week. Whereas in a given workout, you can think of it a couple different ways. In a given workout, by the time you get to that 7th set, 5 you're good, 6 you're like, yeah, the 7th set, the 8th, 9th, and 10th set are just junk. And you may even be inducing so much inroads to recovery that you don't make it back as well as you should or could. And there are a couple thoughts there. One is, and there's a study that we may have mentioned before. Maybe this is something we covered. I can't recall, but there's a study that came out of Wernbaum's group. This is the one. Did we talk about this here on this podcast?
I think we might have.
Yeah, they used blood flow restriction, and they found like a true rebound effect.
Yeah.
So that particular, it's a piece of information that just as a pointer, because most people aren't training twice a day or 7 workouts in 5 days. But the size gains were manifest only 10 days after the last day of training in that second round of training that they did. So they did 2 rounds of 5 days of training with I think a week in between, and they got a little bit of strength or size gains in that second round, but they got the real size came 10 days later. That's when they saw the peak in muscle size. So it manifested long thereafter. So if you're someone who's maybe doing too much, they're doing 10 sets when 7 would have been plenty. It might be that even if you're resting a little bit longer, you're not resting long enough to truly recover. You're able to sort of not truly overreach or overtrain or non-functionally overreach. You're still making some gains, and that's, interestingly enough, what they saw in that study. There were some gains that were had in that second round of training, but they paled in comparison to what was had 10 days later. So take that person and say, okay, let's pare this back so we don't have to wait 10 days for those recovery processes to take hold, which may very well be satellite cell related. That's more of like a week type of time period that we're talking about there. They waited 10 days for those measurements. Satellite cell takes some time to manifest. So that person might be better off training with a little bit less volume. So in that case, the 5 sets twice a week is going to be better than 10 sets once a week, but 7 sets might be good for them. So that's a matter of then personal experimentation to some degree. So I covered a lot there. I know you guys probably have like 9-10 questions brewing.
You're absolutely right about that. Just to confirm with you about this topic specifically, and absolutely fantastic overview, Scott. That was truly phenomenal. So when we're looking at these differences between, a higher volume, moderate effort approach versus a lower volume, high effort approach, do you think there is going to be a difference in response for the individual there? Or is it more of a wash, and it's more so if you psychologically prefer one over the other, that's kind of where the real benefit is. So to phrase that a different way is that if you're going to train to failure, you're going to, by default, have to utilize less sets because you won't be able to recover from more. Whereas if you only use a moderate effort, you keep a few reps in the tank, you're going to be able to utilize a higher volume approach. So from that extent, will the individual respond the same to each? They're just different because of those variables? You know what I mean? Or do you think that somebody could potentially respond better to one approach than the other, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. So you're trying to separate out physiological responsiveness to the or adaptation versus psychological factors that would dictate how you're training to a certain degree. And that's what the beauty of that particular study was, is that they used an internal control. So same person would train one leg 5 times a week and the other leg, say, twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going into the lab and those sets were all taken, quote unquote, to failure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's about as good as you can get. Now, it could have been, maybe that, for some individuals, that leg that was training 5 times was that wasn't maybe growing as well for those people who was sore all the time. And there was a differential effect on training efforts because literally they could tell the leg hurt. They just didn't want to train it. They were walking around during the day and the one leg sore all the time. You can even probably run into disuse issues. I think I know I've seen this, and I suspect this can play a role with people who are training such their legs are always really sore. Massage therapists, and I would notice this when I would do body work. And on myself, if you're training so your legs are really, really sore, you find ways to pick things up. You pick things up like golfers typically pick up golf balls. They don't want to squat with their legs. They just use one leg and they kind of bend at the back, even if they're keeping their back arched, in good form. You don't use your legs. You can actually run into a disuse issue. So there may have been some difference in those individuals, even though they're the same person training one way with one leg and one way with the other leg, such that the leg that was being trained maybe too much was one they were not using as much during the week, and then not as willing to train as hard, because over the course of the training period, they're like, this right leg is just killing me. I'm tired of this thing being so sore. That may have impacted training efforts there. But other than that, that's just something that occurred to me thinking about it. That is a phenomenal experimental model for testing exactly what I think you're getting at, in that they were comparing not different people with different training regimes, but the same individuals. 5 days a week, 3 sets to failure on one leg, twice or 3 times per week, 3 sets to failure on the other leg. The same person. Some people grew better. Yes, go ahead.
So let me state something a bit more specific, because I think we're slightly different in what I'm getting at here. So very specific theoretical scenario. Let's say Jordan Peters, because we know how he trains, right? Let's say he does 6 sets of quads per week with his style of training.
Right.
Do you think he would experience the same results if he did 12 to 15 sets for quads, but kept a couple reps in the tank? So he's just using more volume to make up for that lack in effort. Do you think he would just experience the same results because he's offsetting effort with volume? Or do you think that he might specifically just respond better to a very high effort paradigm?
Well, interestingly enough, he actually tried this.
Okay.
Yeah, he did this. This was in the last year or so. I think it was Steve Hall's Revive Stronger podcast that he was on with Mike Israetel, and they talked about this very notion of kind of using a volume over. And Jordan, some people gave Jordan a bunch of crap, but I think it was a very smart thing for him to do, because he's got so much size and he wants to get as much as he possibly can. That's one thing that he hadn't done. Like literally, he hadn't tried to leave a few reps in the tank and create a volume overload instead of a tensile overload, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I'm a member of his site, and everything he said, and then everything I think we talked about a little bit. I'm not sure if we had a conversation or it just was on WhatsApp and we texted back and forth, but he did not find that was helpful for him. I think he was backsliding a little bit using that approach. I don't know that he didn't try it for like 3 years or something like that, but he was definitely backsliding. And he didn't think it was going to work. And I think he gave it a good go for at least 3 or 4 months, enough to where he could see the trajectory not being one he wanted. And here's why I think that's the case. From kind of a theoretical but a very sort of specific approach, is that, so let's say you've been training for, and this is sort of just my thoughts. It's almost kind of my informed opinion, after having done this for a while. But you've been training for, 5-10 years. If you're natural, you probably got almost much of what you're going to get in those 5 years, let's say. and you're leaving all the time 2 or 3 reps in the tank, and you're doing, let's say, 10 sets, and you want to try to get some greater growth from that. So, and you do that by going to 12 or 14 or 16 sets. You basically, you can look at this in various ways, but basically you're just doing more of what evoked that adaptation in terms of the relative quote unquote intensity, in terms of what each set does to disrupt homeostasis with each set. You're no longer disrupting the system anymore, I don't think, with the volume. And you're also probably not going to evoke any performance adaptations. This is kind of what it comes down to, is that to some degree, and this has been demonstrated with strength, but not so much with the higher rep sets, which also can produce muscle growth. I would love to see someone just go back and reanalyze the data from those higher rep sets and say, did the individuals who went from doing 20 reps with 100 pounds to 20 reps with much more weight grow better than those who didn't have the same performance adaptations? Because you can see this in a few studies that have looked at strength, is that those who make the greater strength gains, it's not a one-to-one, but you tend to see a parallel between strength gains and size gains in the long haul. So that person who keeps doing those, leaving 3 reps in the tank on all of those sets, they can add more volume to some degree, but I don't think that's not going to manifest in any performance adaptations. And if we take the given, and people will argue this, that literally the muscle growth is just, it's sort of a side effect. It's a residual effect from the training that really doesn't contribute much to the performance. I have a hard time, believing that nature would incorporate all these tremendous mechanisms for producing muscle cells, satellite cells, and all the things that go into this, if it really didn't matter in terms of allowing the animal to have greater survival value or to be stronger, or what we would then see as greater performance in the gym. So over time, that person, they're going to run out of volume, some way, shape, or form. Let's say they get to where they're doing their 20 sets or 30 sets. And the only thing that's going to be left is to train harder. And that's going to mean leaving fewer reps in the tank and adding together more effective reps. So I think, to get back to your question, is that eventually there's going to have to be a greater effort that's put forth. If they continue to train with the same, RPE of 8 out of 10, they're not going to be taking advantage of what I think is the quintessential feature of resistance exercise, which produces growth, and that the effort level and the tension and the disruption to homeostasis and the energy demand is all so far beyond what we typically do. There's nothing that would provoke greater progressive overload if you keep that many reps in the tank and you just do more of this sub-maximal effort type of stimulus. So that's my general thought on it, is that eventually you're going to have to be able to train harder. Think of it this way. We'll do another thought experiment and go back to someone who, for whatever reason, you can think of progressive overload kind of from two sides of the same coin. So one thing is to dangle the carrot for yourself in the gym with the logbook. And you go in, you note what you've done before, rotate amongst your exercise. You have some way of setting up a particular goal for yourself on that particular day that you're going to achieve by getting more reps the same weight, or using more weight for the same number of reps, or both in ideal world. So that creates a greater stimulus. If you can actually do that and achieve that, that will hopefully, if you're eating enough and recovering enough, provoke more muscle growth. Well, the other side of the coin is that if you are adapting and you're recovering, you're doing it with everything else, you could just keep the effort level the same, and the adaptations that would occur in terms of, let's say muscle size, would mean that you would just simply have the capacity to do more reps with the same weight, or use more weight for the same reps, or both. So you just go in the gym and you could train just as hard if you're adapting between sessions, and the logbook would just move forward unto itself. And that's actually, I keep on bringing up Luke Sando, but he's just a great example of someone who was a good friend of Jordan's, and said that he just literally, the strength just came on for him. It wasn't like he was trying to to pull 8-plate deadlifts. He just kept on getting stronger and bigger, such that if he wanted to, keep his reps within a reasonable range, he'd have to use that much weight because he just adapted so well. So take that idea of progressive overload being, the dangling carrot, and then the behind the scenes adaptations, and they both sort of manifest into that phenomenon of progressive overload. And imagine someone who goes in and literally, in terms of their effort level, they're not used, maybe they don't have an athletic background. They're just not naturally inclined to just push until they're bleeding from their eyes and they're, want to vomit and they're shitting themselves. They're not an animal in the gym. They just keep that same effort level. And most people get much better at that over the years. In fact, many people will have to reduce their volume because they get so much better at training hard that they simply can't recover from the inroads that they can create. But imagine that you're stuck with sort of a newbie's effort level, and you just allow those progressive overload adaptations to happen over the course of months and years. Do you think you would probably plateau out pretty quickly if you didn't up the ante on your effort? What's your feeling, your guess there? Just kept on training as hard as a typical newbie would.
Yeah, I think if you trained as a typical newbie would, for sure, just because of the research we have on novice lifters and just how inaccurate their perceived effort is, and how, to them what might be 2 reps in reserve is more like 11. But I'm definitely skeptical of the advanced trainee who truly knows what a 2 to 3 RIR is and leaving that number of reps in the tank, if there would be differences in the outcome between that and a lower volume, higher effort approach.
So I'm trying to make sure I follow what you just said there. So you don't think that many high-level trainees can accurately assess, sort of objectively assess, whether there's a difference between what they would get with 2 or 3 reps in reserve versus taking their sets to failure? Is that close?
So kind of going back to the previous example, which it seems, so like you said with the Jordan Peters experiment, is that basically he found out that a lower volume, higher effort training approach is superior for him compared to a higher volume, moderate effort approach. But I'm skeptical that these variables of training don't offset each other. For someone who truly knows what a 2 to 3 RIR is, for that person, if they stick to that and utilize, a higher volume as opposed to a lower volume, high effort paradigm, I'm not sure that there would be differences in results over time because the volume is offsetting the effort.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
So here's where we're missing. Where there's their dimension of time across a 12 or a 12-week study, or a 4-month study, or a 6, or even a 1-year study. But imagine then that the person is trying to make gains over the course of a decade.
Mm-hmm.
And they're still stuck with that newbie's ability to estimate what a true 2 to 3 rep in reserve range is. Mm-hmm. So they may go to where they're doing, and they've adapted to where they can do with that. They've been hypnotized as to not really be able to adjust their effort level. They do 30 sets or 45 sets. But the thing that's missing is that effort level. If you could then, release the hypnosis, snap your fingers and say, now I want you to be able to perceive this, and then they can grow in terms of effort level, then they will be able to make gains. Whereas if you take someone And like, you can sort of flip flop this around. I haven't thought of it this way, but imagine someone, and this is kind of like Jordan, who does know how to get to a true 0 reps in reserve, and that person is training with the most volume they can recover from. They don't have the ability to add more volume and recover. So we've got hormesis to consider. They're basically, for that 0 reps in reserve for most of their working sets, is giving them the optimal adaptation, because any more would cut into their ability to recover between workouts, and resting more just doesn't do it. They basically optimize their frequency and volume. That person then is gonna, if they drop, and this is what Jordan experienced, if he drops down his effort level, now he's made each of those sets a less potent stimulus for growth. And this is the quintessential essence of your question. I think this is like, what are you really asking? Can you take 10 drops or 20 drops of a less potent medicine, and is that the same as 5 drops of a really potent medicine? If the less potent medicine is 25% concentrated and the more potent is 100%, well, then you think you can do 20 drops of 25% that give you the same amount of the drug or the poison or the stimulus as 5 drops of the 100% potent stuff. But I don't think it works out that way.
Okay.
But, yeah, and this is my thought, and this why I've said this a few times, is that eventually, now some people are going to get, and this may be like splitting hairs, at the top end with a lot of, I think some people, their genetics are so good that, and many pros are like this, that they can become extraordinary without ever having to really push that way. And would Jay Cutler, for instance, have done better if he took more of a Dorian approach? Or people say, would Dorian have done better if he took more of a Jay Cutler approach? Mm-hmm. Well, the thing that can come into there is, how would the recovery, and how would they have withstood those types of training regimes? Jay Cutler might have just end up tearing muscles more so than Dorian did near the end. He may have just broken down from that. Maybe this was the best, in terms of his overall longevity over the course of decades, the best way for him to train, because he was optimizing the negative effects, the arthritic effects, all the things that sort of cause you to have the nagging niggles and aches and pains, the things that get in the way of having prolonged, persistent periods of making really, really good progress. Maybe Jake just couldn't have done that with a more of a Dorian or a JP Jordan Peters type of approach. But I think if you go if you're using the 20 drops at 25% potency type of thing, you are missing out on what I think is the essence of what makes the resistance exercise stimulus work in the way it does. And actually, there's some I'm not a pharmacologist, but there's some parallels here too. Is imagine you've got drugs that have the same area under the curve. So you take the drug, one's a sort of a long-acting one, and another drug produces an incredible spike and comes back down. So by analogy, and don't take this too far because I'm developing this right now as I speak about it. This is another new concept for me. By analogy, I think it's the peak of the drug or the potency of the stimulus that's created with each set, which is more important for the adaptations that are evoked. So you may have the same area under the curve comparing, a long-acting drug versus one that has a shorter half-life, and those things would seem to be equivalent. And I think in many studies, it's going to be a wash, without a doubt. But I think that when it comes to resistance exercise, there is something to say for this peak or the highest amount or the potency of the stimulus, which is getting to 0 reps in reserve. Absolute mind-boggling effort. That seems to be the thing that's what differentiates resistance exercise from pretty much anything else you're doing. And if you think about it, another way you can kind of justify that rationale is looking at what happens in terms of satellite cell proliferation, protein synthesis, and even general when you compare concentric versus eccentric only contraction training regimes, you get a better response and adaptation from eccentric only, generally speaking. You can do that with isokinetic machines, what have you. And if you think about what's happening at the level of the muscle tissue, the relative amount of force that you're producing, and this actually points specifically towards tension being the primary driver of adaptation, so to speak. The relative amount of force you produce during those eccentric contractions is much higher than what you get on concentric. Depending on the speed of contraction, it could be twice as high. That's why you get so much soreness. But it's also why injury is what turns on satellite cell proliferation as well, just in and of itself. So that kind of points to this idea of potency being important. And there's another film that we haven't, one more thing, and then I'll let you go. This is kind of important to keep, it may even change your question too, or your thought, is we've got this hormesis thing, which I've kind of touched on, but there's also that. So it could be, let's say, harken back to that 2 sets per week or 2 workouts per week versus 5. It could be that just for some of those individuals, regardless of the fact that maybe they weren't training quite as hard with the 5 times a week training regime, or, maybe that explains some of it to some degree. There's an optimal amount of stimulus in general that people can recover from. And so, too much, you don't have optimal adaptation. Too little, you don't have optimal adaptation. And there's probably variability as terms of what is optimal adaptation in terms of potency. Some people, there used to be a bunch of 1 versus 3 set. The whole slew of those came out years ago. It's like, okay. And the 3 sets typically were better off, right? And, HIT, Mike Menser, those guys would say 1 set. And for some people, that may actually be best. That may be, for them, the best combination of sort of potency of stimulus and volume in whatever sort of recovery regime they're using in terms of frequency of workouts. I wouldn't go so far as to do like every 2 weeks. But how those things combine in terms of volume and potency can be very variable as well. And it depends on all the other factors in the training regime. So it could be that for you, like, the perfect workout is 3 all-out sets, but you do that every day. No, that's not the perfect workout. That's only the perfect workout. It's only optimal in terms of hormesis when you've got enough time to recover from it. So that whole hormesis idea is something that is sort of envelopes or umbrellas the entire topic as well. So yes, sorry, I interrupted you.
All right. So before I try to sum this up for our audience, and we transition to our next topic, to confirm with you and your position. So if we took Jay Cutler, you mentioned that his style of training would facilitate longevity better, right? Likely over the course of a career.
Possibly. I was just guessing why that might have been better for him. Obviously, he did pretty well with it. So
possibly, but if he utilized a approach which was higher effort, going to all-out failure, would you speculate that you're speculating that as an advanced lifter, that's the type of potency you need per set to continue facilitating adaptations at that level of training?
So everyone's going to be different. This is the thing.
Oh, okay.
So yeah,
okay.
So that's why I brought up that last idea that it's the combination of that. His sets were very potent. I mean, I heard a story like that when Phil Heath tried once to train with Jay, when Phil was up and coming and, Jay was sort of at his prime, that Phil couldn't hang with him. And Phil did that same type of training. And Jay just used to bury people. Mm-hmm. So what he did was it wasn't Ronnie Coleman-esque, but I think it's underestimated as to how hard he could possibly train. So, here's the thing. Could Jay maybe have peaked out if he decided to drop his volume back and train closer to failure? Maybe, but that may have created a more potent stimulus for muscle growth, maybe for him. But that might have been a more potent stimulus in terms of the muscle, but something that literally would have disallowed creating that stimulus in a matter of weeks. because of all the other aspects of his particular physiology and how he was eating and recovering, in a way that his joints might have gotten so sore he might have ended up with golfer's and tennis elbow and bicep tendonitis, and he may have been so sore and so incapable of continuing that any advantage had there was no longer optimal for him. So for him, that pushed him, in terms of the other things that have to be in place to create that stimulus, too far in terms of inroads into recovery, in terms of connective tissue, overall inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. So possible, but he found his sweet spot. That's another way to just say it. He found his sweet spot, and it's possible. But I think for many people, I don't think many people train the way Jay Cutler can train or trained. He was pretty far up there. Probably an infinitesimally small thing, and it could be with his genetics. He's not going to get much out of it. Maybe, 2 more pounds of muscle at most, maybe. But that would have only been if you could have prevented those other adverse effects that might have happened. What would have happened to Dorian? I think he said it himself. He probably could have trained for a little bit longer, but he had this mentality which got him to where he was, but also was the same mentality that got him pushing harder than he should have during his preps, and that's why he had those tears. In fact, I think he was from his first to his second Olympia, when he took a quantum leap. He said this on numerous interviews, that wasn't because he gained so much more muscle in the off season. He just didn't diet it off during his pre-contest period. So sometimes it's just finding, that doesn't mean his training regime was wrong. It's just that he was applying too much of it and pushing too hard, and for him it ended up causing a backslide. So it's hard to know, and you have to say. So I think most people don't train the way Jay Cutler did, and all those those are teensy tiny gradations. So I'm not trying to interrupt you, but it's a hard thing to pin down in black and white because everyone's different. But anyway, yes.
Yeah, no, that totally clears up. So what I was inferring was that you were speculating that at an advanced level, you are more or less required to take your sets to all-out failure in order to continue driving a stimulus. But what I'm now receiving, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that in this process of figuring out what works best for you, step 1 is to assess your psychology and your preference. Do you prefer to take your sets to all-out failure, or you prefer to perform higher volume and leave a little in the tank, right? So we have to see your psychology first. And then from there, when we're looking at physiology, we can't necessarily just offset a lower training effort with volume. The individual physiologically may very well respond better to one approach than the other. Yes. You know what I mean? So we can't just say that if you reduce your effort, you can just compensate by increasing the volume. It's not that simple. You may very well, based on your genetics, optimize your response through higher effort, lower volume compared to the opposite approach.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Yeah. And there's probably each person, here's another way for the mathematicians out there. Each person you could probably devise, if you had, the mathematical genius of this, a regression equation based on effort level and volume, which would vary per muscle group. You probably have to put in also frequency or duration between workouts to optimize muscle growth. So you're gonna have some amount of effort. It will play a role in there. The volume will play a role in there. So if you have low effort, more volume would be needed. If you have high effort, less volume. And then at some point in time, you're going to start to see a plateau in your gains. And for many people, if their effort level isn't very, very, very high, that's going to be the place to go. And I think the clearest answer for many people is they've got, as a beginner would, they've got many more reps in reserve, and they may be doing plenty of volume. The volume is not the issue. It's the effort. And the way you can know whether that maybe is lacking is, are you becoming a more impressive lifter in the gym? Meaning, maybe you're still you see guys. There was a guy that I saw. It's been a couple years ago. He was local hitter Tampa. I've seen him a couple times. He's probably 40s, 50s, older guy. Awesome physique, amazing physique, and he's bench pressing 2.25, and he probably was at least 260, 270, something like that. Pretty tall guy, and he was single percent body fat. If you had told me I didn't recognize him. You told me a pro, I would have had no problem. And he was doing 2.25 on the bench press, but the reps were absolutely perfect, and he did a lot of them. And the set just kept going, kept going, and kept going, and kept going. So he was doing high volume, high effort, and the weight wasn't all that high, but his effort level was super, super high. And for him, it was something he had just channeled in. So that's where a lot of people have a way to increase one of the variables of their particular regression equation for getting more muscle mass or optimizing it. And the other thing is that regression equation probably changes over time as you progress. So for some people, effort level's no longer going to be a possibility. And if you're getting older too, your recovery may be changing in a way that you're going to have to drop the volume down, because you're still able to train really high if you're kind of a knucklehead like I am. But eventually Father Time catches all of us. So the equation changes each and every year you're training. So yes, you've got it pretty good. And remember too, for anyone listening, go back, like those two ends of the spectrum. I was trying, like, just for the sake of clarifying, there's all sorts of variations in between. And it's really cool if you want to post the link to that study that I've mentioned, where they have the individual data points in terms of percent increase. Like literally, you see people like some making great gains, some equal gains, some shitty gains, some good gains overall. There's all sorts of combinations, and that was with just basically 2 different types of training regimes for one muscle group using one exercise. So it could be quite complex, but yeah, I think you've got my idea. I think we're on the same page now for sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Can I add something? Potentially,
Please.
even though we've been on this road for a while.
No, let's dig in, man.
So in this Jay Cutler example, and he's training and like leaving some reps in the tank potentially, right? And then you have the other camp taking everything to failure for every single set. But would it be potentially, not to say balance them out, because they're kind of on opposite side of the spectrum, but you structure a training block where you start keeping some reps in reserve at 2 or 3 reps in reserve, and then by the end of it, you bring it to complete failure. Are you able to maximize what you can get from the high volume end and then still eke out as much hypertrophic stimulus as you can by the end of it? And then at the same time, you're at the end of this little training block, so you can kind of take a step back, active rest or deload, if you will. So then you kind of avoid straving off the issues that you would run into with recovery and joints and things of that nature.
Yeah, that's this idea of resensitization, which various people have put forth. It makes total sense right now with some people being able to go back into the gym. Is even though the protective effect of previously injurious exercise, the repeated bout effect, it can be in play for months after the initial bout. You're still, if you go into the gym and you haven't been training with weights at home, you didn't have a gym access, you're going to get there's no need to do more than a very simple basic workout, and you can indeed do that. And that plays into this idea of hormesis, is that you go in at the beginning of a training block, and let's say you're going to get, this, there's some variation. It doesn't take nearly as much in terms of effort or volume with a given load or what have you to produce an inroad, which you can just sense in the amount of soreness. If you went like right in balls to the wall after a short deload or a break, you'd be much more sore than if you'd done that workout at the end of the previous blast or previous meso or microcycle. So that means that you can do less and basically get the same stimulus. And if you're smart and you've kind of figured this out for yourself, you know where you should be. You shouldn't be just crippled. You can do that and then get an optimal amount of stimulation so that your adaptation from that particular workout is more at that peak of that hormesis curve. It's not that because that workout that would not have been much of a stimulation for growth in the previous training blast wouldn't have done much for you. It would have been just sort of a waste of a workout, maybe even. So that depends on how you're structuring things. Sometimes not. But yeah, that idea absolutely, utterly makes perfect sense. And people do that. There's so many training plans that do that, they incorporate that idea. And I have that built into fortitude training in terms of just simply volume. If you're used to doing 3 sets, you can just do 1, and then maybe add 1. If you're not, you don't have to do fortitude training to do this. Maybe add 1 of an exercise that really rips into you, and then maybe add a second exercise. If you're just doing like 1 work set per exercise of something that doesn't create nearly the inroads, and then eventually you work your way back up. So yes, absolutely. The fact that's really what you're doing all the time to some degree, if you're auto-regulating. So that's just being smart about your auto-regulation, because about the previous. It's not like you've just been plopped into this moment in time in this workout and you don't know what you've done the weeks before. You know that if you try to do what maybe you feel like doing, you're going to destroy yourself, and that's just unnecessary. That just pushes you back. So yeah, that's an awesome point. Very good point.
This may or may not be my last comment on this specific topic.
No, let's keep going.
We'll see. But so psychology of the lifter is first in this hierarchy we're creating, right? So what style of training they prefer. But say in this individual who prefers to keep a couple reps in the tank and do high volume training, they may not psychologically be able to handle a low volume, high effort, taking every set balls to the wall, right? But physiologically, they may actually respond best to that, and they never reach their maximum muscular potential because psychologically they are unwilling to perform the style of training that is required for it. Yeah.
I think that it's hard to know because you can never get them to do that, right?
Because they won't experiment with it.
They won't do it. They're just simply not going to do it. Yeah, right.
And what we're getting at here is like you can't just offset that by doing more volume. You may very well just respond better to failure training with lower volume. But if you're not willing to experiment, you'll never find that out, and you could never reach your potential because of that. You're limited by your psychology.
Yeah, it's kind of a moot point, It's like okay, that's great, but you're not willing to do it. Like the guy, that's why I told the story there. He's not willing to do that, He's always complaining about he wanted his legs to grow and those sorts of things, and leg training is sort of renowned for being one of the most brutal type of training. It creates the greatest metabolic stress overall. You gotta. To really love leg training, you really have to love training in the first place, and he just wouldn't do it.
But I think some people in this evidence-based community would say for that guy, well, it doesn't matter. Like, he can just keep with his style of training and just perform more volume, and it'll come out to be the same because there's this dose response with volume and hypertrophy. So, yeah, he can't psychologically handle going all-out failure, but that's fine. He'll hit his ceiling regardless if he keeps performing more volume. You know what I mean? That's what some people might say, whereas we're kind of saying that's not necessarily the case with volume.
And I would point them to the Damas study, which shows individuals that did more poorly with the higher volume training regime than they did with the lower volume training regime. I mean, those are examples of people. I mean, if volume were always superior, and the study, they need to refine more of these data because it was actually the same 3 sets workout, so it was both frequency and volume. But if we just look at the volume aspect of this, it was 6 or 9 sets versus 15 sets. If 15 sets sort of is your max volume, then why did some people do better with 6 sets than 15? That's a lot less. That would mean that they would do better with 3 sets than 6, maybe, or like what's their dose response look like for volume and muscle growth? They're out there, it's definitely 15 is not optimal for them. That they were way overtraining, I guess, or they didn't regress in this case, but they were doing more than was ideal. So that's the thing is that, and when here's the thing, and I brought this up now a few times, but I think it bears repeating. Is that the studies, and this is why I love this study so much, is that they came to one conclusion when they looked at averages. and they used, standard inferential statistics and compared the means. This is what you typically would expect. If you wanted to, is there going to be some systematic difference between the lower volume or the lower frequency and the higher volume, higher frequency that you can, like, systematically on average, that you could place money on is going to happen on average most of the time when you pull people from this population as they did. And you can't argue with that. They have the data there. That question was answered. But the more important question that we're talking about is, what are the individual responses? What are the individual nuances? And if you look at the data where they've looked at, where they actually published the individual data points like they did in this one, you'll see tremendous variability in all sorts, basically in every measurement. You've got responders and non-responders that comes with endurance training as well in terms of VO2 max. Muscle protein synthesis is all over the place, especially if you measure it like right off the bat at the beginning of a training regime, which isn't worth doing because a lot of that's just probably reflecting the muscle injury and the damage that's happened. So that's another study that same group has published. So if you're looking at the evidence and you're just looking at it from a means perspective, sure. If we took, Mrs. Smith versus Mr. Jones first grade classes, and they're in the same elementary school, and we had those kids, pick out their favorite lollipop, yes, you're going to find that there's no difference between those two classes, blah, blah, blah. They both like the lollipops, that's fine. But if you ask those individual students which their favorite lollipop is, you're not going to get the same answer from everyone. They're going to be all over the place. Some of them won't even like lollipops. Their mom used to hit them over the head with a lollipop because they try to eat it before they had dinner, and that's only for dessert. Whatever. Like, there's going to be all sorts of variability in those sorts of things. And that's why this study where you see the individual data points is so very important and critical, because that's getting us closer to, okay, we got a big picture. Maybe you see dose response, without a doubt, that's going to be the case. But that is not an exact 100% dead-on prescription that's going to fit everyone. We see in that particular study where they didn't see any difference in frequency or volume, that does not hold whatsoever if you look at the individuals. They were all over the place. So that's evidence as well. And I think that's even a more refined level of evidence that only the people who are doing the studies actually will end up seeing, because they're looking at the data, and sometimes people they can lie with statistics if you want. And I'm so glad that they recognize that and looking at their data points, to see, okay, what's going on here. Sometimes it's a standard procedure in many cases to throw out the outliers. There's a great book that I've talked about before on my podcast called The Black Swan, and I won't go off here like I did there, but the idea is that, like, a lot of the things that have been really tremendous in terms of changing the course of human history have been things that are quote unquote black swans, totally unpredictable outliers, things that you just never would have expected to have happen. Like 9/11 was one, like this COVID thing was one. Actually, the black swan was like what we did in terms of sort of shutting and locking things down. Like, no one would have expected that 5 years ago. That's going to change human history pretty substantially, I think. People won't argue. So if you look at the data, if you want to find like what the really important pieces might be, is like, okay, who are the people who really grew well? Okay, this person, not so much. This person grew well from 2 or 3 times a week or versus 5 times a week. They're just a grower. So that's probably, there's a genetic component there. Maybe you could go and look, maybe they made measurements of RPE, and you ask them like, well, that guy always had a 10. No matter what he did, he always had a 10. And that was impressive effort. It would have been awesome to see they administered their protocol and saw that those people took their sets to momentary muscular failure because, whatever I don't know exactly, let's say their criteria for that were something like, the repetition could not be completed within 5 seconds. So they considered it like, or the speed, came to within 5 degrees per second, then the rep's over. They basically stalled mid-rep, they're done. That's momentary muscular failure. But what happens if you ask those people how hard was that? Well, with the newbies, we know it's like, how many reps do you have left? 2, and then they can do 9 more. Maybe the people who grew the best in both occasions were the ones who, when you ask them if they had 2 reps left and they actually only had 2 reps left, who knows? Or when you asked what their RPE was and they said 10, the ones who rated it the most. Those are the individual bits and pieces that are the things we really want to know about. Is like, why do people grow better? Did someone who grew better in both conditions in that particular study grow better because you could maybe look at the velocity, and that's an indicator of how close you are to failure. That can be used, velocity specific training has become kind of a big thing. Or look at those individuals who grew really well from the high volume versus the low volume. Maybe they weren't training as hard, and that for that reason they found an more optimal way to train, doing 5 sets with not quite as much effort. That gave them the best bang for their buck, because 2 or 3 sets was just too low of a volume for their level of effort. Or the other way around, 5 sets was too much for some people. 2 or 3 was all they could recover from adequately. So that's where the evidence is. People that's evidence in and of itself, and think that's maybe more important piece of evidence, I think, than looking at the statistical means. So that's, I think, something to consider that we oftentimes don't if you're just reading abstracts, you're not digging in on the literature. There was a study that I just posted on Facebook. Someone talked about GH and its impact on ACL recovery. People can go and look at that. I found the study and I read through it, and I'm like, the study doesn't make sense at all. It's nice to see that, but the study didn't make sense for a lot of reasons. Just read the study. It wasn't like I'm a genius. I just read the study and looked at that doesn't make any sense. The strength gains manifested, 16 weeks after they finished the GH treatment. It's like, okay, but they didn't match with muscle size. So where's the applicability to bodybuilders? Like, I just read the study. I read the title and the abstract and the study. Like, that's where the evidence isn't the whole thing. So anyway, sorry, that's a little rant for you. You can clip that for Instagram if you want.
Yeah, I think Mark Cuban funded that, so it's like really making the rounds as far as popular media goes.
Okay, yeah.
But excellent stuff, Scott. Cole, anything to add before we transition to our last question of the day?
No, I think we beat that one up pretty good, but we can come back to it. There might be more.
Yeah, I think we hit on that one pretty well.
Yes.
All right. So, Scott, you've been extremely generous with your time. So, if you don't mind, we'll just slide one more question in for the day and we'll be good to go. Cool. All right. So, when it comes to this experimentation process and finding out what works best for you to optimize muscle hypertrophy, we'll have a lot of people say, if the program works, if you see any amount of progress whatsoever on this program, stick to it. Do not change anything. Write it out. But when it comes to bodybuilders, people who want to maximize everything, they might not be okay with the minimal effective dose. What is your opinion on this? If you're seeing progress, just stick to it. Once you plateau, then we'll change it. Or do you think we should be experimenting to see if we could be making more progress quicker with our training program?
That depends on the person. And where they are. I mean, like I said, like we mentioned, if you're just starting out, you're gonna grow from most anything. And if you're someone who's been at this for 5 or 10 years or longer, and you're making progress, then I would be very happy with that. If you can see it and you're measuring this in terms of you're doing DEXA or what you're seeing in the mirror, or you're getting strength gains, whatever your markers of progress are, then without a doubt, I would go with that. So that's kind of my basic answer to that. It's going to go back to the person, and I think this is something that I really think applies to fortitude training to a good degree. 2 things actually that occur to me. One is there are people who start my training system and they've never done a type of training regime like that, with higher frequency type of regime. So it's not that fortitude training was, necessarily per se anything that was optimal for them. I've tried to put in things that made sense to me to make it a good program that would fit many, many people. It's simply that they are now getting novelty of stimulus and some of the things that weren't in their previous program. Let's say there's someone who would have done better with a higher frequency regime if they had been a subject in that dominus study. Now they're getting that. So they've simply just changed the stimulus and it's become novel again. And that, I've seen people argue against this, but in my mind, novelty of stimulus is really what is provoking the adaptation. And so if you're able to do more reps, the same weight, if even if the exercise is the same, that's a novel stimulus. If you're using more weight for the same reps, that's a novel, or both. Those are all novel stimuli. A new exercise is a novel stimulus. That's why we rotate among exercises. There's I think it's Frontera study where they used a variety of different exercises and they found growth in all the quad muscles as opposed to fewer exercises. So a novelty of training, periodization is about novelty of training to some. You're changing the nature of the stimulus in a way that evokes growth because there's something different. I'm not going to evoke the Joe Weider muscle confusion principle, but that's kind of what he was sort of getting at. Like, you're not trying to confuse the muscle. You're trying to actually be very, very particular in saying, we're going to keep on producing. You're going to keep on getting stimuli, things that disrupt homeostasis that tell you need to grow. So there's no getting used to this. You're just going to have to grow because I'm going to keep on telling you, stand up, get out of the chair, straighten your knees, extend your hips, be upright, look me in the eye. Like, those are all ways of, I want you to stand up and be looking at me. I've said the same thing 6 different ways. Different programs can do that same thing. So there's something to say for that in terms of simply switching programs. But if you're getting the growth, you'd want to keep on doing it. Unless you're someone who needs that, and this is the second point that I was going to get to, unless you're someone who needs that novelty to renew their motivation. So we're back to the psychology here, and keep on training, because if you're continually to bounce around for programs, then there's probably something that tells me that there's probably something lacking in terms of motivation. You're not able to hunker down in the way that you probably will need to in the long haul and being consistent and just grinding out gains week after week. You're just looking for something to kind of, divert you away and like, okay, this is something new and different. You're not able to focus, which is going to happen in some way, shape, or form. But on the other hand, it is good to have some variation there because that does provoke a new sort of an upsurge of motivation. Eventually that runs out and you're just kind of left with dedication. You just have to be dedicated and, have an intrinsic motivation that has nothing to do with the external circumstances. So the individual is going to kind of dictate that. One of the things that I've seen with my training program, and I saw it with DC training, is you could take, for instance, the people who grew the best from at least that regime. And this is people with that mentality. And that's sort of a more kind of hardcore, I relish the suffering. It's sort of a badge of honor to go in there and, bury myself. If I didn't have a good workout, I feel shitty the rest of the week, that kind of mentality that is, almost self-abusive, maybe you might say. But the people that would do really well with those types of training regimes, you look at their logbooks and they would put their bent over row logbook numbers in with the weight and reps, and they would just keep chipping away at that, chip. And literally, here's the thing. Imagine you start off with bent over rows for 2 1/4 for sets of 10. Just think about that one sets of 10. And all you do is add a 2.5 pound plate on average every 3 weeks to that. So that's 5 pounds. And you do that, maybe 12 times in a year because you'd have some off times. So that's 60 pounds in a year. Now, if you do that for 3 years, like that's kind of ridiculous. You've gone from 225 to 60 pounds times 3 is 180. So what is that? 405, something like that, or close to it, somewhere around there.
Mm.
That's 3 years. Your back is gonna show that something's. I don't care if your form has gone from perfect to just crappy. That's a lot more weight. That's very, very impressive if someone's able to do that. And that's just grinding out a little bit at a time. And what a lot of times people will do is they just aren't willing to do that, and they're not willing to be satisfied with that. And I think nowadays too, like take a big picture look at this, you've got so many. You don't see very many people posting things on social media or Instagram where they're not that impressive. You don't get any follows, you don't get the likes. What you see are the people who are doing, 7-plate deadlifts and 405-pound bent over rows, and they've got just amazing physiques and those sorts of things. So that sort of sets, our general threshold for what's cool and what's awesome, is to be just, an absolute badass. And for the person then who has more humble genetics, so to speak, who just wants to add like 1.25 pound plates on each side. So just 30 pounds a year. If you can put 100 pounds on your bent over row from, let's say it's, 225 just to 315, you go on a plate over 3 years, that's going to show up too. And someone who's done that, who literally has, imagine the likes when you just show your logbook, Some people aren't, I would think that'd be badass. That'd be just absolutely amazing, to someone like that's someone who's getting down and dirty with it, because that's perseverance. That's fortitude. Like, that's sticking in there and just going and going and going and going and going. And that adds up over time. But that's not the thing that it catches our eye nowadays, and that people really can derive satisfaction from. And if you can retune your perspective in a way that it really appreciates the effort that's gone into for you to just make those small gains, you're not one of those people who just goes in the gym and like the weight just comes on automatically, like it kind of did for Luke. He literally said he didn't have to push to get that strong. Most people would never get anywhere near as strong as he was, no matter what they did. Food, drugs, anything else, not a chance. But it happened to him almost accidentally, just from living a very solid bodybuilding lifestyle. He didn't have to push the strength; it just came. So people see Luke or someone, or like Ronnie, or someone who's just a machine, and that's phenomenal. That's wonderful, and it makes it hard to appreciate the dedication and the work that comes from someone who's just average, who's pushing to become better than average and become the best that they can be. So I think, now stepping back to your question, is that having that sort of perspective on what it means to follow a program to its bitter end, to just squeeze out every last drop of progress that you can before changing the program, is something that people aren't willing to do. And they may just simply have to do that. We're looking for magic bullets most of the time. Most of the supplement industry is built on that idea, right? Like gain 30 pounds in 30 days or whatever it is. It's like we have all these incredible solutions. It just doesn't work that way for most people. So, I did DC training basically for like 8 years. And the first, I have to say, like the first maybe 6 or 8 years, it was just strict, like what you see on the internet. And I would do whatever Dante was having Dave do at different times. So those were some things that were thrown in there. But like there was at one point in time, and this is Dave Henry is who I'm talking about. IFBB Pro Dave Henry, 2008, Mr. Olympia, 202 Mr. Olympia, or Olympia Showdown, I think they called it, or something like that then. But so Dave's like, he placed top 10 in the Olympia at 5'6". So he's a top pro in the world. And we went back during one of the off seasons because, Dave wanted to get more size because he's getting outsized just because he's shorter than all these guys. And we went back to a DC training 2-way split 3 times a week, because that was the most brutal way of training. You've got to empty yourself and that's what had worked before. It's very, very simple. It wasn't like any highfalutin complex thing. We're just doing rack deads and bent over rows and heavy presses and just gutting it out, inch by inch. And it was, of course, it's Dave Henry, so it's always cool to train with someone like that. And he looks great no matter what he's doing. But that is what got it done. And that's the thing that it's really hard to see, because you don't have examples of that. If you go anywhere around you, and the guys who are doing that, a lot of times they're very humble anyway. So no one's going to pay attention to them anyhow if they're grinding out like that, because they're overshadowed. So I think most people probably program hop more than they could. Sometimes you just know. I mean, sometimes the program just isn't working, and you got to use some common sense. You're going nowhere, and nothing's changing in terms of your body composition, your performance variables. So in that case, you'd want to move on to something else. But for a lot of people, you have to kind of step back, I think, and say, okay, what can I expect? What's my overall goal here? And look at, if you're a natural competitor, look at what natural bodybuilders are doing. They're not getting the 250, at 4%. Like a 200-pound, 4% bodybuilder, natural bodybuilder on stage is a monster. There's only a few guys who've actually kind of gotten to that, and they're usually 5'10" or more, I think, in terms of height. So if you're playing that game, that's where you can expect to be in 5 or 6 years. You're going to have to just grind it out. Don't expect that all of a sudden you're going to get 20 pounds in 3 months. And so know that if that's the path you're going to take, it's kind of like, I'm going to climb to the top of Mount Everest, and for me, and it's going to mean I'm going to be gasping for air. I'm not going to be running up to the top of that thing. It's going to be a slow trotting. So stop trying to find a level way to where you can run faster and it can be easier. You can move more quickly. It's going to be tough the whole way up. So if you keep that in mind and really relish what is progress for you, and stop comparing yourself. Like, a great way to fail is to compare yourself too much to others, because you'll always fail compared to somebody. There's always someone who's going to do it better than you. And start relishing what it is that you've done, and recognizing, even, I tell you what's more impressive than just about anything to me is someone who still sticks with it, and knowing they're optimizing and doing everything they possibly can, and they still keep going because they've got the perseverance to do that, and they're actually relishing the journey as much as the destination. That's a big part of it too, I think. So got a little philosophical there, but I think most people probably bounce around too much. And if you're making some progress, if you're someone who's not going to make that much progress in the long haul because of how long you've been training, or the fact that you're a natural competitor and you're not going to compare to the guys on the Olympia stage, for instance, then keep that in consideration as to when you change programs, and train for longevity. If there's a type of training program that might mean you're 3 pounds less muscle, but you can do it for 30 years as opposed to 3, then do the 30-year program. You'll be much happier in the long haul. So those are some big picture things we can dig in more if you want on like more particulars, but that's the stuff that really matters, I think, for most people in the trenches.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that entirely, Scott. Yeah, really well put. And at the end of the day, you have to figure out, what you can commit to and what you want to get involved with. But yeah, I think enjoying the journey and learning to enjoy the journey, and kind of, as you went with that analogy there, climbing Everest, you don't sprint up it. It's a long, right, treacherous journey, and I think you can get the most out of it if you really do just indulge in that process and the small victories along the way. And that program that could burn you out in 3 years and break you down might not necessarily be as good as one that would last 30 years and get you more or less the same results. Mm-hmm. But I think we're going to wrap it up there today. We truly appreciate another really in-depth discussion that you brought us, and I hope all of our listeners also really enjoy it. I know Mike and I have, as we did last time as well. So Scott, I'm going to link below your social media, your website, and your book like last time, but is there anything else you want to plug or potentially mention here?
You guys ask awesome questions. You guys do a great job. And what I like quite a bit is you're actually listening to me and you're following up. That's phenomenal. Like, you need to get some kudos for this, because sometimes that doesn't always happen. It's not always the worst thing, but I really appreciate that, because sometimes you need to scrape and scrape and scrape until finally you get down to the important stuff. So you let me scrape, and then you help me dig into the more important things too. So I appreciate you helping me. I think I came up with 2 or 3 things that I'd never even thought of before just in this conversation. So thank you for helping me to do that, because that's a nice thing that I don't always experience with interviews.
Yeah, we definitely dug further and further down the rabbit hole in our discussions today, and we got really in depth with the nuances. But those are our favorite discussions here. That's why we have the podcast. But thank you so much for the kind words, Scott.
You're welcome, guys. My pleasure.
All right, everyone. Well, hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll catch you all in the next one, and hopefully we'll have Scott again on sometime soon.
Electricity allowing, we will, yes.
All right, everybody. Take it easy. We'll catch you in the next one. Bye.